you all for coming out and being interested in community solar power. We, in Wendell, thanks to Don's initiative, put it together, which Don will tell you about, and Greg. Went through all the rigmarole to try to get us a system for Wendell that was a co-op that was owned by each individual homeowner, and all the advantages of owning a single system by your own home would now go to the 50 people who are in the co-op. But we'll hear more about it, and I can introduce Don Stone and Greg Garrison, and they will explain what happened. I'll wrap up a little bit after they finish, and then if you could ask any questions you'd like, it'd be great. So we might as well start with Greg and Don.
Okay. Well, thank you for all being here. I know there's a wealth of information that can be shared within this room, and Greg and I are just a piece of that, not the whole of it, so we'll try to leave some time for that wealth to be shared. When I was asked to come and do this presentation with Greg, it was about 4 months ago, and we thought we were on the verge of starting to put the spades in the ground and sinking the foundation and building our solar, and it would be up and running by the time of this meeting. Everything was in place. We had spent 3 years, starting with a few people in town who got together and said, you know, wouldn't it be nice if all the people in Wendell could have solar even if they didn't have a good location on their property? Several of the people who started this idea already had solar, like myself, and felt the benefits of it. Others didn't, but wanted it. And we worked together for about 2 years, just tossing this idea around, wondering how it might come together, and fortuitous things kept happening. One of the first things was that all of a sudden the right piece of property appeared. An abandoned house in property in the center of Wendell, well located in terms of the power lines, and sitting there with a good site for the kind of small solar community solar co-op that we wanted to put up. The second thing that really happened that made it fly was Greg Garrison and Northeast Solar came on the scene, and what they brought in addition to the expertise of doing solar was a model that had been already worked out and vetted for the co-op side of it, so that we could create this community-owned solar co-op that would provide all the benefits and incentives that an individual homeowner would get by putting it on their own roof, but here the solar would sit in a common location and the benefits would be distributed through the co-op. It's a great model, and you know, we were very excited about it. I also want to say that one of the things I think that moved it forward nicely was broad support throughout our town. Wendell's always been a pretty progressive place, and they like to support community things, and they had to come out and support this idea. Not only those who wanted to become members and have their solar power through the co-op, but the rest of the town too. At one point, we had talked with the select board who really helped us out and was supportive, and in order to make this possible, a vote of the town at a town meeting was required to allow the property to be converted from taken off the tax rolls and turned over to the town for the purpose of letting us lease our space on it. And the town voted unanimously in support of this idea. And this was just, you know, another kind of boost that we got along the way of people wanting this thing to happen. So we kept progressing. There was a lot of design work that had to be done. We cooperated with all the boards in town that are concerned with how this goes in, most particularly the Conservation Commission, which is concerned about wetlands. We had to do some hopping through hoops to meet their demands, but they were fair and reasonable, and we sat on the verge of, you know, let's start this construction. We had a lot of people signed up as members, not complete capacity yet, but we were well on our way. This was in October. We were ready to dig, and then we got the word from National Grid, you can't connect. Our application had been in for quite a while, and National Grid said, well, the reason you can't connect is that there's so much solar power wanting to connect to the system that our substations are unable to handle the capacity. And so, all you big solar power arrays that are waiting to attach will have to wait until we conduct a study to see how much additional power we need, what it's going to cost, and you'll have to pay for it. Now they did say we could go ahead and do this on our own if we wanted to come up with the $3.9 million that was their expected cost of the upgrades.
3.9 million, that's it?
That's all.
Just million?
Just all. Just 3.9 million.
I thought you were going to say billion.
Well, it might just as well have been. I mean, once you get all those extra zeros on, what does it matter? Okay, so it basically stopped us in our tracks. The town continued to rally behind us. The select board, who had been supporting us all along, contacted National Grid and said, would you please reconsider this? This is a town project. It's for householders and residents of our town. It's not a commercial venture that's benefiting some outside investors. It's a community solar. We support it. We want you to support it too. And the National Grid wrote back and said, no, we can't do that. We're bound by law to follow this procedure and not break the line that has been formed for people waiting to get in. It didn't matter that we were 1/4 of a megawatt, whereas most of these other folks in the line were 5, 10, 20 megawatt operations. National Grid told us, well, you're 0.35% of the waiting capacity that we have to get ready for, but we can't let you in because you won't fit. So anyhow, we were stymied, but we're not giving up. The model remains a good model, and that's what Greg can talk about. It's I think, a really excellent way for solar power to be made available in the community, under community control, with community ownership. It's a great model. What I've described our state now is, the Wendell Community Solar Co-op, is we're alive but in a kind of state of suspended animation. And we have a lot of animation. We're still working. We're trying whatever we can do to try to convince the National Grid to relax their holds against us and let us proceed. We're ready to go, and we want to bring solar power to our community in this way, and we will.
My name is Greg Garrison. I'm the president of Northeast Solar. I actually started my solar venture in this school. I come from a fossil fuel base. I used to burn gas to make money. Back in 2008, when capitalism finally died. I took some time off, sold my last company, and entered the renewable energy program here at GCC. Here I met some wonderful people in the program, and they knew about my background in business and starting businesses, and they said, you need to go out and start a business so you can hire the people that are going to school here so they can have jobs. So that's what I did. I joined a small company that was only 3 people at the time. We're about 20 now. We're still just a very small company in perspective, but we've built it kind of on one founding principle, which is the economic model of solar. Everybody that has a home, apartment, or anything else every month has to write that check out to a utility. And that money that our human capital creates is taken out of the state and giving to the investors that own these utilities. And that's why they're called investor-owned utilities. So for us, solar's always been an economic model where we want to take those dollars and we want to accelerate them back in the local community. So we're only a direct ownership company. We don't do leases. We don't do third-party stuff with investors. All we do is direct ownership. And that has funneled a lot of that money back in. Our company has installed close to 1,000 systems now, or over 1,000 systems. Will return tens of millions of dollars back to the local economy with this. And that's money that now that, if that $150 a month going to utility is no longer going to utility, it's staying in our communities. That money is dispersed elsewhere. And that's the primary model of everything else. In that, when we were starting to do that, and this was, I want to say, over 5 years ago or more, we realized that about 70% of the housing stock and 70% of the people out there had no access to solar. Their houses didn't face the right direction, they were underneath the trees, there's a number of different reasons that couldn't happen. So the economic benefits in participating in the solar incentives and all the programs that were available were not available to them. So at about the same time, this model, this third-party investment model, which had been around for a bit, you think of Solar City and Vivint and a lot of these other large companies that build these massive megawatt arrays, were building these systems and then, you know, providing the benefit to the homeowners. And generally just percentages off their electric bill, you know, the cost of electricity. So if you're paying 20 cents, they may sell you the power for 18, 15, whatever the number is. But the majority of those benefits, specifically the investment tax credit, the SRECs and now the smart revenues, were still going to the investment groups. That's money, that's our ratepayer money, that's everything else. That was still flowing out of the state. It was still flowing into the pockets of investors, now back to our local communities. And one of the greatest hurdles was that as an individual, if you had a site that was not connected to your house, and you wanted to take that tax credit, there wasn't a mechanism currently at the time for that to happen. And the 30% tax credit is one of the biggest benefits of solar. So we started designing what we call a solar cooperative. It's not community solar, it's called the solar cooperative. And we spent, well, Northeast Solar spent about 3 years and lots of money with attorneys and everything else vetting this model. So we ended up, we actually filed for a private letter ruling from the IRS that said, if we build it like this, with this type of structure, can the tax credits flow through to the individual? And they said, if you build it like this, and if your structure looks like this, and the homeowners are taking direct benefit of it, then yes, we'll let that tax credit flow directly to them. So we beat that one big hurdle, which was how do we pass that tax credit around to the homeowner? The next hurdle for us was the Securities and Exchange Commission of Massachusetts, and also on a federal level, said you can't have people buying this as an investment. Because if you're going to have people buying it as an investment, they need to be qualified investors. And qualified investors have a very high hurdle. You know, you've got to have lots of assets, you have to have all this other stuff. So that gets rid of most of the people that were looking for solar. So then we spent another year and change rewriting our model, setting it up with the Securities Exchange Commissions, and then finally getting their approval. So at that point, we had a model that was approved both by the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And essentially what it is, it's a single cooperative ownership in which all the members that are purchasing the solar belong. So there has to be the single entity, which allows the relationship with the utility to happen, you know, where all that will happen and where all the paperwork and everything else comes from. And then it allows for the individuals who are buying a portion of the array to be able to take their percentage share of that and take it, you know, have those credits applied to their house, have any incentives sent to them, etc. So when, actually it was Don's son who bought solar from us and then said, you should talk to my father because he's got this, they've been trying to work out this kind of thing, and I said, perfect model, these two will match perfectly, so we went to Wendell. And at that point, we finally found a place where we could do this. And essentially what it is in the case of the Wendell Cooperative, everybody would buy a solar panel. There was a cost per solar panel. And there was a couple of things that had to happen. One is that you couldn't buy more solar panels that would produce more power than you could use at your house. That was one of the hurdles. So if you wanted, now there was an exception where you could buy up to 120% because if you wanted to buy an electric car, you want to put mini splits in the future, something like this, they'd let you do that. So they'd let you buy a little bit more than that. Because what they didn't want, what was really important to the Securities Exchange Commission was that they didn't want you buying half the array and then becoming your own utility in the town, and then selling it to all your neighbors. You know, so they didn't want that happening through Schedule Zs and everything else. So there was one restriction as far as the size we could do. So everybody would buy their solar panel for a set price, and they would own it. We also got approval from the Mass Solar Loan Department, which would allow us to both people to finance that, and then people who met certain income categories would also be able to gain the low-income principal forgiveness. So it was fully financeable by the Mass Solar Loan. And that worked out really good too, because now everybody could take advantage of financing it if they wanted to. And the way that we set it up was essentially there would be a co-op, and members of the community, I would start out in the co-op itself. I would be the principal of the co-op to start with, to execute all the agreements and get all the utility stuff done and all the building permits and write all that stuff up. And then there'd be a 5-person board who would start, and they would be on the board for the first year. And they would be the ones that would be managing all the sales, transactions, all the accounting and everything else. So we were setting them up with a complete software package that they could use to track all this, to put all this stuff together. And then they would, then I would step away from the board, resign, and this model becomes theirs. It's their community solar project. It's their power plant. It's their benefits. So you're taking 50 homeowners and you're taking that $100 a month or whatever you want to call it, and you're putting that all back in the community after everything's paid off. So having a power plant in the community is like having a small business economically. All that energy dollars comes back to the community. And if you think about the way municipalities started a long time ago with their own municipal light plants and their own municipal systems, where they run the electricity and the towns kind of benefited and the community benefited from low energy, it's a similar model. We believe that this model, and it's still viable, we just haven't, as Don spoke about, there's a very big issue with capacity in the grid. And it's of my opinion that we have paid over decades to the utilities to maintain and upgrade their systems, and they failed to do so. Plain and simple. The utilities model is primarily based upon the fact that they want to build big things for big price tags and then you get a guaranteed return on it. Repairing stuff and putting in new poles and all this other stuff is not enough money. They want to build power plants. They want to build hydro up in Canada. They want to build power lines from Canada to New England. Those are the big ticket items they want to do. This capacity issue we have now with like these solar cooperatives, we're going to be looking at possibly expanding those in the eastern part of the state, because the current incentive program that came out, which is called SMART, in western Massachusetts for these types of systems is already waitlisted. It's already over capacity. They didn't design it well at all, and they didn't take into account a lot of the large scale stuff that's happening out there. So we're still going to be developing this, but we're looking in the eastern part of the state to do it with another partner to build some of these in the communities, because these are the models that we know that the economic benefits will flow back to the communities, and this is what we want to be able to do with energy in general. For those people who can't put it on their homes, and that's still the best option, we want to provide this model that's available. So I didn't go through all this time just to sit and wait to find out when I could possibly build another one. We had to wait till the new incentive program came out. We had to wait for a lot of different things, and now we're waiting for this big study that the utilities are doing to see when they can, how they can upgrade their systems. What they won't look at is the simple stuff. The simple stuff is if you have a substation that's over capacity, instead of rebuilding that entire substation and rebuilding the transmission line flowing into that substations, you can drop in storage.
Yes, that's, yeah.
Large scale storage. You know, you can put a megawatt hours of storage next to these, and containerized storage, and all the excess capacity that's flowing into that substation goes into those storage containers.
Essentially batteries.
Exactly, large scale lithium batteries. And the substation takes the power from those storage devices and moves those into the substation at a rate that it can accept. And even after the power at the sun goes down, you have all this storage that's still able to flow through those batteries into the substation. It's a very simple fix, much less expensive than rebuilding the entire infrastructure, rebuilding the transmission lines and everything else. The problem is that the way our current grid is set up, it's set up for all these power plants to produce power. So when the lights go, when the sun goes down at night and the lights go on, these external power sources, these external power plants want to make sure that they have capacity that they need to fill here. And if you have all this storage all over the state, they're irrelevant. They don't need as much of the stuff. So that's a big hurdle for them to overcome. So that's one of the reasons they're not even really looking or exploring this type of thing. But it really was something. Well, even with the solar that we were planning out there, we were planning on setting it up for on-site storage. So you can expand that in a number of different ways. You could make it its own little microgrid, which could be directly connected to your emergency centers, or you could just have power banks there that people could walk up and plug in stuff during an outage. They could plug in their own batteries. They can plug in other stuff. And that's typically what you'll see. You'll see those types of storage things. So it makes the community a little bit more resilient also. The main reason to do all this again is to distribute those benefits of solar so those people who can't have it, and to take these little economic models and place them in communities where they'll do the communities the best economic. And that sort of is.
We'll have questions after.
Yeah, so just to quickly, this model exists. We've been somewhat protective of it because if the model is out there and people are trying to develop it and they don't follow the procedures correctly, and the SEC or the IRS clamps it down and stops it, they'll cancel the model because it's what the Security Exchange Commission told me was, this is all good as long as it runs this way and you protect it. If it goes outside of it, as long as everybody follows exactly the same things, it's fine. But if we find that it's being at any time abused or misused or not properly represented, it's no longer going to be viable because we can't have this model out there floating. So that's one of the reasons we've been kind of protective of the whole thing, because there is an opportunity. There's always an opportunity with people who are looking to monetize any type of model to be able to misuse the model in some way for their own benefit. And this benefit is actually, a company like Northeast Solar, where it makes its money on this is when we build it. That's it. The ongoing revenue streams, for maintenance, the ongoing revenue streams for administration and all those flows to the co-op. It doesn't flow to any one company. So there isn't a single group of investors or a single company that's all this stuff is flowing through and they take their piece and they pass on the rest. This all goes back to the community. And all those members within that co-op have the right to vote their own boards in, they have the right to set their own rates, they have the right to set their own maintenance schedules, they have the right to do all this. It's their power plant. It's maintained by them, it's owned by them, and they seek the benefits, and they receive the benefits of it. So that's pretty much the kind of the overscope of everything else. We still believe generally that solar is a really viable economic model, and we consider it a threshold technology, meaning that it's just the first stage for energy within our communities. We're very pleased that even though a lot of the investment tax credits and everything else were used by investors, the investors were the ones that scaled it to the size where we've got the price points that are coming down, and we've got rapid development all over. But when you think about the addition of storage, smart home technologies, being able to manage consumption and production, and managing all those things, solar on the roof or solar in a field is just a threshold technology. It's the first step of kind of energy economics independence and just general energy independence whatsoever. And it's highly important that we're looking at that in that way, because we need to move past our addiction to fossil fuels and the way that we use them and the way that they impede our lives. And the sun is the source of everything on this planet. I mean, we don't exist without its light, so the fact that we're not using it for our energy as primary is silly. So, but anyway, that's my soapbox spiel, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Greg. I think it was very well presented, and everybody here that's interested in community-owned things can follow the gist of where the money is going and why it's going there. The investors with their large, you see these large solar things popping up all over the place. You know who's making the money, all the middlemen and all the top men. And in Wendell, we decided through Greg and Don that we could do it to benefit the community. So right now we can take questions, and I think the gentleman here had the first up.
Yeah, isn't it true in Florida, they're basically trying to ban solar energy entirely, right?
Unless it's owned by the utility.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, because if it expands the way you'd like it to, I mean, it'll hugely disrupt them.
Yes.
Those investors are shaking in their boots
Yes.
Right.
about this, right? See, why? And it seems like, boy, if you could somehow change it from having a 120% cap to a 200% cap,
Yep.
that would be a hell of a lot better.
Yep.
And if you're at 200%, you're not your own utility. You're just two households.
Right. Doing that would require going back to Security and Exchange Commission, and what they're very concerned about is that somebody buys this for $1,000, whatever the number is, and then in 5 years, for whatever reason, they have to move,
Yeah.
and then that co-op share is going to be passed to someone else. What they don't want is somebody that purchased this going back and saying, well, when I bought this, electricity was at 20 cents. Now it's at 30 cents. So the value is actually more like $1,200. And I want to make, a profit on this. And that's not the way it works. The Security Exchange Commission was very clear that it has to be it can only be transferred for its value going forward at the time it was purchased. And the 200% or higher than that, they were afraid that people would be banking energy and somehow, passing it off to neighbors for a difference or whatever the case may be. And it would take, that threshold made them kind of happy at that 120%, but 200% makes a lot more sense with electric cars, mini splits, and other things you're going to be doing.
Or an addition on your house.
Or an addition, they just want to make sure that, and again, you're always, in the co-op model that we designed, so somebody leaves, then those 20 panels, 50 panels, whatever they purchased are still in the co-op. They can't take those with them. And other co-op members have the first right to repurchase them.
Yeah.
So if you started at 120% and you put your addition on and somebody left and there's another 40 panels sitting there, you can go, oh, I can buy those now because I won't beat that threshold.
And is there a minimum purchase level of 50% or 30%?
No, there was no minimum. I think the minimum we had was 3 panels.
Yeah, it was a question of transaction cost that gets to
The 3 panels.
Actually, we actually resolved
Yeah.
to not put any limit on it all.
Somebody wanted to buy 8
But the
panels.
way it works
Yeah.
out, it's not really economic for the purchaser if they're only going to have 1 or 2 panels. For an average sized household, this thing had a very favorable looking economics. For one thing, building the array in one place makes the construction cost per household or per household served lower than if it was put on the house itself.
Yeah.
So there's that savings that gets passed on in addition to all the incentives.
Yeah.
And when we were working out the numbers, we were looking at when you combined with the Mass Solar loan, there was a 0 upfront investment and a recapture of the total investment within about 6 or 7 years. And the process would run for 20 years, so after that 7 years, everything would be positive return.
Yeah.
And I think the return on investment worked out to be above 10%.
Yeah. And one last question. The $3.9 million, was that just for the Wendell project? Or
Yes.
Was that...
I think what
bullshit,
that,
right? I mean,
A town of
there's no
850
way
people.
So
I mean,
with the way
if there were 10 Wendells, it wouldn't have scaled out to 39 million.
No, so what happens is you first in queue, you're the one responsible for coming up with the initial infrastructure costs, and then they pass the cost on to it. So this thing, where it started at 3.9 million, could have gone as high as 10 million, you know, with full costs involved. So,
But if there were 20 Wendells, it wouldn't scale out to 78 million.
no, the first in line would have to pay out the 3.9. They said we could interconnect, we just had to pay the 4 mil.
All right, we have a few
Sorry.
other questions.
Sorry.
I
Go ahead. Thank
think
you.
Glenn was next, and then this gentleman back here.
Yeah, 2 questions. Do we have the same problem with Evil Source and the other utilities? And what's the legal or legislative solution to this issue?
So, we've been working legislatively for a while. The Baker administration has not fully supported the type of development that we want within the solar industry, obviously. Eversource and National Grid are both in it. Eversource is probably the worst for interconnection. They're very costly and very difficult to work with. And their model is essentially, and they're well ahead of us legislatively, lobbying, you know, gaming out, you know, the long-term aspects of what solar is going to look like in the state. So it's very difficult because we keep playing catch-up. They're able to throw in legislation and write it in their fashion. And then by the time it gets through, we're like, no, that's not even where we began. And now we've got an issue with it. So I've been making the rounds with the legislators I have that are in our districts here locally. I've met and sat with all of them and talked about it, introduced myself, told them about legislation we're looking at, especially around net metering, the SMART program expansion, et cetera. The first week of April, the second week of April, April 8th, I'll be flying to DC to meet with Congressman Neal, who now sits at the head of the Ways and Means. And I'm also going to be meeting with both the senators' offices as a part of a group that's going with the Union of Concerned Scientists to lobby for a 10-year extension of the 30% tax credit for residential and direct ownership systems. So that's scheduled to scale down next year and go down overall. So I'll be going down there to work on that. But that's truly the only fix that we have is legislatively. We have to get the legislator to override what's in the tariffs and to change those. To have some real penalties to the utilities for disrupting interconnection or delaying interconnection. It's really a legislative focus right now. And that's really the fight we're in.
How do people find out about supporting legislation?
We try to post on a regular basis what's happening in the legislature. I'm also a founding member of a group called Mass Solar, which is a group that is working legislatively. It represents solar owners, environmental groups. We're kind of a broad-based coalition. And we can, if you go to solarisworking.org or masssolar.org, you can get information on it and you can become a participant. You can join or you can sign up for the newsletters and stuff that we do. So that's the easiest way to stay ahead of it.
This gentleman back here was
So, in keeping with the theme of the conference, what would be same or different if Wendell had done it as a town? Municipal ownership.
Nothing, as long as they had the model. It would be theirs. I mean, municipalities, essentially, if the municipality owns it, they can't take the tax credit. So it has to be the members of the community. What we try to
But do the members lose the tax credit because the municipality does it?
The members lose the tax credit. If the municipality is involved in any way of ownership of the system, they will lose the tax credit. So what we try to do is when we're finding sites in communities, what we first go to the community and say, do you have property of about X size, 5 acres, and these are all small systems, we're not building on 20 acres of land, that is off the tax rolls that you'd like to see developed, that you would like to get a pilot for, you know, payment in lieu of taxes, a regular fee for. So it allows the community, the municipality to also participate because they're getting a regular lease and or pilot payment from the array. So everybody benefits. So that's what we did in Wendell. Instead of going to a private landowner and having them run it and all that. So.
This interconnection issue is not the first time that
No.
And I'm curious why the Carter phone decision, you didn't exploit that,
What's that?
the Carter phone decision.
I'm not familiar with that. So
That was the one that allowed modems to be connected to AT&T's network.
Yep.
And it went up to the Supreme Court, and,
Mhm.
and they tossed out AT&T's claim that it would harm the network.
Well, our biggest, it's very similar legislation along that, but we're looking to, fundamentally what we need to do in this industry and with other, is we need to change the utility business model. We just need to flip it.
Yeah.
And it needs to become a bidirectional grid.
Yeah.
And that's our primary focus.
Yeah.
Once we create a bidirectional grid, all this becomes, the utility should be compensated for the adoption and interconnection of this energy and maintaining the wires and all the stuff they were originally designed to do, and not be in the business of building
Yeah.
large-scale power plants and utility lines, et cetera.
So I think that is an important thing to you know, solar does not work without a grid. It could do well without national grid perhaps, but the grid is very necessary for the whole thing to work.
Well, but the crux of the matter is, you know, the utilities have separated themselves into distribution and generation.
Mm-hmm.
And what you want to interconnect is to the distribution. You don't
Correct.
care about the generation. That's the owner's problems.
Correct.
And it's not clear to me why, since they were allowed to break up into distribution and generation, why you can't attack the distribution part only and interconnect to that, because it has nothing to do with generation.
Yeah, it's ISO New England, and the way that our cabal is set up in this area is very difficult to crack. They have a lot of people out there that have invested large sums of money in production facilities, you know, energy producing facilities, and the other day, and I think actually John's wife Claire was one that brought it up. John's from the Solar Storage, good friend of the company, good friend of ours. He's also a member of Mass Solar. His wife pointed out the other day that when we have one of those really clear, cool days, which is just beautiful for solar, that the load that was on ISO New England's grid actually went down during the day instead of up, because there was so much solar producing, they didn't have any load to take care of. The load was less than, so it's, when you see curves like that happening, we know we're making that.
Okay, I think this lady was next.
So, are there any other states that have a utility company that has performed more maintenance or done anything? Is there any good story?
Well, you know,
About the-
one of the, so, Vermont is a state that's very close to what we
I've
do.
read about that.
And Green Mountain Power has been trying to do a lot of things, but you have to understand the roots of Green Mountain Power. Green Mountain Power is owned by one of the largest gas companies in Canada and in Europe. And that company is owned by a consortium of different entities, which includes the Saudi royal family. So energy is a very heavily traded thing, and Green Mountain Power is a very good example of working with renewable energy, but it's kind of a testing bed for them. It's not a lot of their numbers and dollars, but it gives them an idea of what it's like to interconnect wind and solar and do storage inside homes, and it's kind of their beta tester to do it. But Green Mountain Power will be one. Outside of Massachusetts, I'm only focused on Massachusetts, you know, I can't tell you what they're doing out there.
This lady, and then this lady. Yep.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
So it's not a very educated question, but given that we're calling this conference about socialism, as you describe it, it sounds like we have people struggling to have a community-owned, non-corporate owned in the long run system, and we're bumping up against a corporate-owned grid. Now, the question in my mind is, we're sitting there and not thinking about how we have to revolutionize the grid. You alluded to it when you said we need a bi-directional grid, but I mean, is all the grid everywhere in the United States completely corporate-owned?
No, some of it's municipal owned, some of it's local. In the south and other places like that, they have.
I'm talking grid.
Yeah, with the grid. So
I mean, I remember when there was that big blackout. I can't remember how long ago it was when there was a lot of media coverage focusing on the grid.
So every kind of, there's sections of the grid that are interconnected to other sections of the grid. There's just nodes that go across the country, they connect to transmission lines, et cetera, and there's different structures. Some are actually built as cooperatives. You know, there's electrical cooperatives in some southern communities. There's investor-owned, there's municipal-owned, but it's essentially one grid, one large grid, and that grid flows around the world. I mean, electricity is ubiquitous. I mean, you go anywhere and you flick on a light, you never even think about it.
Right.
But that power had to get to that light bulb from somewhere. So we've been very fortunate that that exists, but it hasn't been maintained, and it isn't designed for the future. And that's kind of what we're looking at.
Yes, this lady here.
When you started, Don, you said there's a lot of people in the room. I'm interested, I know that Co-op Power also is in this work, and if there are others, if you could just save a couple of minutes at the end so that we can just hear what other options there are.
Yeah, I think that would be
great.
a good idea.
But I also just want to say that the Northeast, at the Greenfield Industrial Park, we tried to build the same model, and many of the people at this conference were signed up to be cooperative owner members of that. And we ran into the same problem with EverSource, where they were supposed to get back to us on interconnection. This was,
Yeah.
I don't know how many years ago it was.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah.
long, it's history now, but maybe 8 years ago. And EverSource was supposed to take 55 days to respond to our interconnection agreement, and they took a year and a half.
Yep.
They combined us in a group net metering study with a 2-megawatt project down the road in the industrial park from us that applied just recently and said the result of the study was that we had to pay, we just had a 0.5-megawatt project we were trying to do for 100 people, and the result of that study was that the group down the road that was doing the 2-megawatt project had to pay $688,000 to interconnect. Sorry, they had to pay $322,000 to interconnect, and that we, with our 0.5-megawatt project, had to pay $688,000 to interconnect, and it killed the project. So
Wow.
the utilities, you know, as you were saying, they're not trying to figure out how to help have any kind of scale to even individually owned projects. And I think that we need to come together in a really cooperative way within the solar industry, like how can we work together more effectively and really get these projects done and get our lobbying out there, because the utility is a public utility.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be accountable to us. It's supposed to be working for the common good, and it hasn't been. We have our first cooperatively owned solar co-op actually getting built next week after in West Hampton, and it's taken us a year and a half, and we paid EverSource $17,500 to put in a new pole, a new service a year and a half ago, and it just got put in last week. But a year and a half is too long to wait. So we're not getting the cooperation, collaboration, and we, as residents here, we deserve to be able to own our own solar. And unless we're working together, I personally am willing to do civil disobedience at this point. I'm so angry with the way that the utilities are taking over the right to build. I think EverSource has reached its cap by building its own solar out, by delaying and overcharging and really stopping this development work. And I think it might be legal, but it's really, really not okay. And unless we're ready to stop it, it'll continue. So I'd really encourage all of us to, figure out how to get involved in these legislative efforts.
I thank you very much. I should just interject a little bit here. We had National Grid came to us a few months after. They said, oh, sorry, we have to put you on hold here, and told Wendell, first I heard that they were proposing to buy the piece of property, which happened to be next to one of the private owned panels that were going up. And then they offered to lease a portion of it so that they could put in a temporary substation. So we had them come to the select board, and if anybody in here is questioning what's pushing all of this, all you have to do is listen to where the money is going. First thing that happened was, he said, and this is the thing that I remembered from the select board meeting, the guy said, oh, we're so interested, any individual household can sign up that wants to, please get your people to sign up. And then one of the questions was from one of our community members was, well, this is 50 households, they're just doing it together, why can't they sign up? Oh, well, you know, it's too big. But then he said, and this is a quote, National Grid was asked at the March 6th Wendell Select Board meeting whether National Grid could install 3-phase lines throughout Wendell, opening the entire town to massive solar developments that would clear cut forests. The National Grid rep said, that happens all the time. We're always putting in these 3-phase lines all over these small towns because the developers have requested it. We're obliged under the regulations to do whatever they want. They pay us, we build it. Well, where's the money there? Why are they paying them? Because they're getting their 30%, they're getting, no, we'll give you 10%, we'll make 20. We know where it's going. And I encourage all of you, back whatever Greg is doing here, the legislation that we can overchange this. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm right with you. Yes. Pam.
Well, just, this is not my story, so I'm not going to mention any names, but I know a developer who was trying to put solar on one building and was stalled and had to pay $150,000, as I recall, twice because they ran out the clock. They ran out the clock, didn't install it, and forced the guy to pay $150,000
Such a terrible thing.
twice. So I think you might have some developers on your side if you decide to do.
Question?
Yeah, I really appreciate the phrase bi-directional grid because I think it gives us a political thing to hammer at. That's the future, and the Green New Deal is going to, we're going to have to rebuild the whole damn grid nationally anyway, and locally, statewide, nationally, turning up at hearings and saying a bi-directional grid. The other argument that's not exactly economic, except it is when storms come through, you need local resilience. I mean, look what happened to Puerto Rico. They're stuck because they had that lousy centralized system, which is still had to be rebuilt. So making the argument on the basis of resilience, and then I'd like to hear about the battery storage that really could be there. Give us the dream system so we can have these all over and local substations be the emergency backup and even better. So what does a bi-directional grid look like in Western Mass and in New England and the statewide? And
if you take a look at Australia, they're probably the prime example. They were having a real grid issue with grid resiliency down there and with energy spikes and loads and issues. And Elon Musk came down and installed a whole mess of batteries. Containers full of them. I don't know how many megawatt hours were installed there, but what he did was he balanced the grid and he provided grid resiliency. So now they don't need additional power plants, they don't need any fossil fuels, they don't need anything else because they've got this system. What we've said all along as far as in our substations, in our grid here, is that installed storage would take all the energy that's coming in that's at overcapacity, if they want to look at it like that, and would store it. And then it could be used at a rate in which the grid will accept it, and then you would have additional reserves left over in the evenings. And or if you lost a large central station, you would still have storage if they didn't cycle it 100% every day. You could still have local storage that would be able to provide backup energy to grid nodes throughout the Commonwealth. So it's always been our position to do that. It isn't what the grid would like to do. The grid would like, the primary focus that we have on our utilities right now is they want a gas pipeline. They want to bring in more gas. They want to build more gas power plants. That's what they want.
God bless them.
That's their sole focus. And we, until we can get them passed, until we get our legislators to get past that, it's really tough for us to bring up how we create the new bidirectional grid, because it's got a legislation, the only thing the legislation say is that we want the DPU, the Department of Public Utilities, to move the grid to a bidirectional grid. So then the DPU gets all the hearings, and they get to write the regulations, and they get to issue tariffs, and then it goes back. But the legislators can't say, do this. They can only direct certain agencies to do certain things, and that's where that's kind of where the pressure comes from. They can change stuff like net metering. They can change stuff like the size of the size of the capacity blocks that are available, or monies that's available, tax credits, etc. But as far as managing the DPU and that relationship, they're not hamstrung, but they don't have the full power that they should have.
Yes. Isn't it possible in 3 or 4 years, Mr. Musk or someone like him is going to come up with some amazing battery that costs $2,600 that any household can just install, and then if you have a nice, you're all set. You've got your solar panels, you got your battery, and you don't have anything to do with the grid.
Yeah, we're getting closer and closer and closer all the time in technology. The price of solar per kilowatt hour storage needs to come down so much, and it will. Which you're going to be. We're very close. I mean, we're installing batteries now at homes, and it's mainly there's no true economic benefit to it. It's mostly backup power they need it, and it's more controlling their own production and consumption. So they're producing during the day instead of flushing it out in the grid. They're putting in their batteries for later, and then when the household goes to sleep at night, about 10 o'clock, the batteries take over the load. Yeah. So throughout the night, it's taking care of the house's complete load. It's not drawing anything from the grid. And then, not all the energy gets cycled, so there'll always be a little bit left in there in case there's a power outage or something. So it's got some backup power, so you can run your well pump, your furnace, keep your refrigerator going, a few critical loads or critical systems. But most importantly, that if there's an ice storm coming through or there's a big snowstorm coming through, you can have the batteries loaded and waiting for it. So that's already there. It's only going to get better. One of the things that utilities, we don't tell the utilities we're installing batteries. They have a program through SMART that gives you a small, few pennies or whatever else. But they want you to cycle those batteries when they want you to cycle those batteries. So when the load is high, they want to take your battery storage and put it in their grid. And they should have the right to tell you when and how everything happens. The other thing they won't allow you to do at this point, which is something we need to change, is if you do want to put in batteries for your own resiliency, they won't let you charge your batteries from their grid. So, I mean, if you bought like a gold zero battery and you plugged it into the house, you're never going to know any difference, and that's the same principle that we have if we install a battery bank in and you want to charge it from the grid, but it provides resiliency. In these massive ice storms we have, or anything else we have, if every household that we installed, our economy almost would not stop like it did for 3 days or a week or 10 days in these big ice storms. The economy really wouldn't stop that much. You'd still be able to function on a day-to-day basis. You wouldn't have people closed, schools, stuff like all that's infrastructure stuff is.
But so like that, for example, those 50 households saying, oh, you got to pay 3.9 million extra. Sure, it would be a lot cheaper, those 50 people, why don't you just go independent, just buy 2 batteries.
Well, the problem is that when the power flows out of the central facility, it's got to go up on their lines. And the lines.
Well, no, that's what I'm thinking. Maybe it's just no line. It's just all independent.
We're not there yet. You still need the grid, and when the electrons, solar is a dumb technology, really. I mean, it's just. Yeah. Photons hit it, it blows electrons out, and that's the extent of the technology. Yeah. What we're trying to do is make it a little bit smarter and control that. And when something hits the grid, you have no control where that goes. If you created a microgrid in the town of Wendell, and one of the things is that we were fairly close to the safety complex. So we could get approval from the utility to run, because what we do is we deliver it at their voltage, so we take 480 volts for, anyone wants to be wonky, and step it up to 13,000 volts. and that's what's in your overhead dollars. So what we would have done is we would have had a secondary, if we put batteries in or a secondary system, we would have had a way to, with the utility's permission, to run dedicated lines over to the safety complex. So when the power went out, and if there was storage there, then you could just flip the switch in your safety complex to have energy, or the library would have energy, however you wanted to move that power. And then you would have a bank of outlets there that people can drive up and plug their phones in, plug with, a gold zero battery to power their own, internet router or refrigerator, whatever they wanted. So you give some resiliency to the community that way.
I should add that I have a friend on Martha's Vineyard who has never been on the grid and has his own solar panels with batteries in a certain room in his thing that he takes care of and isolates. And he's been off the grid for 15 or 20 years. And whenever the island goes out, which is fairly regularly because there's a cable that goes underneath the sound, everybody else's lights are off and he's got his lights on.
Everybody comes to his house.
So, yes, sir.
Just curious, you were talking about the Wendell planning to have storage. Is that included in the 6 to 7 year payback?
No, that would be, we would design the system to be able to interconnect storage at a future date.
Okay.
So once the co-op is, once the co-op is built and the board is up and running and the co-op members are all a part of it, it's theirs. They can have a meeting with their board and they say, you know what, instead of passing along these incentive benefits back to everyone, we're going to pool a little bit of money up over the next 5 years and then we're going to install batteries. It's theirs to do what they want with it.
Currently, it wouldn't be cost effective. I mean, the technology of the battery levels.
It's a small enough system. It's really easy to create electrical banks in a solar field like that. I mean, just do it with little transformers that it could be used during the day. So you can have that simple access point for individuals to charge something if they wanted to. It's pretty easy. That's built in just about everyone because anytime we build a system of similar size, we always put electrical banks in because we bring testing facilities out like laptops and stuff like that to do it so we can plug it right into the power plant and we can get power there. So that's a typical.
Yeah. So your question, I think, is good about the idea of creating this locally controlled, locally owned facility. And we, of course, never have yet gotten to the point of actually having it up and running. But, certainly putting in the batteries, putting in solar charging for vehicles, maybe even the town owning a couple solar-powered vehicles for providing rides for medical purposes for our citizens. There was just a lot of, there is a lot of potential. And this idea of this vision of something that's so much better than what we have today, I think is an important part. We shouldn't lose it all in animosity towards National Grid. We should keep part of our attention focused on what can be. And it's really pretty exciting.
Yes.
Would it be totally crazy to say for this stage, just go it alone, like the guy in the vineyard, as a community?
You wouldn't be able to do anything with the power. It's still going to move the power from the power
You
plant.
have to put up all your poles and wires.
Yeah,
to the houses.
These are just.
Well, I want to hear the rest of it.
Yeah, so these are, what we're wanting to do, and it's something that was developed in Germany a long time ago, where they used to call power nodes, where they put little power nodes around their communities, where they would have renewable energy that would flow into their communities. These are essentially community-owned power plants. That's what they are. There isn't a 20-year deal with an investor. There's no PPA agreements. There's nothing of that sort. It's owned by the community or the members of the co-op, and they decide how it's worked. So they're essentially power plants. And once you understand the relationship that you have a power plant and you have a relationship with the grid, and the only thing we're trying to do is make sure that relationship is balanced.
Yes.
So I have a question now. Okay, so I have a brother who's an electrical engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave me a couple of books, which I haven't totally read. But these books talk about the vulnerability of the entire electrical system with a bomb exploded like 60 miles up in the air. So and we are evidently extremely vulnerable. So this would blow up our use of solar power, our use of storage systems. And I realize from having worked on this stuff for a long time that if we are generating off wind power, which has been voted by the legislature to 2,400 or something like that, megawatts, enough to power most of the state, we have to have really sophisticated storage.
You'd think so.
But then here we are vulnerable to this,
Solar flares.
yeah,
No,
solar
electromagnetic
flares,
pulse.
bombs,
Yeah.
all that. So can you address that in any way, or do you know
Well-
anything about it that you can?
Well, no, the grid is very vulnerable. The grid is vulnerable from cyber attack, the grid is vulnerable from EMP, the grid is solar flares. It's a very, if you think about it in the terms that it's created, it's a very archaic structure. It really is. There's not, it's like buying it's like if you went out and bought a laptop today, it'd be the same laptop that you bought, or the same computer you bought in 1984. We'd still be using floppy disk. You know, it's essentially what we're doing in the grid today. I mean, they are advancing it a little bit and making things a little different. But it's still power and wires. Wireless electricity, getting more power from space. I mean, there's all kinds of new technology coming out there. But right now, it's strictly an investment model. How do we keep these things, and how do we make our return on those investments?
The return on investment, what's the rate of return on a community project versus the rate of return that the utilities are allowed to get?
Well, I know the utilities is, their recent tariff was 8%. So if they put $1 billion in, they'll get 8% return on that money.
So
As far as I forget what the return was on the Wendell project for everyone, but it was close to 10%. Right?
I think it was close to 10%. It varied depending on people with low income, if they qualified for the forgiveness of the portion of the principal of the borrowing, it could get even better. But I think for just a straight person paying out and getting back the incentives of the solar credit and the SREC, well, the smart returns, it was about 10%.
So in effect, the utility is preventing shareholders from seeing the same sort of return that they do.
No, you can just invest in BlackRock or Vanguard Group, or you can get your returns there, right? That's what they would like you to do.
Well, maybe you can.
No, I can't.
Yes, I'm just curious, how was the Wendell project going to be financed? And if you're sort of on permanent hold or impermanent hold, is the financing holding up?
Okay.
The actual construction,
Yeah, that
land purchase also.
originally what we had done within our group was all agreed to kick in a certain amount of capital per person to finance the first stage of that. And while we stood ready to do that, Northeast Solar pretty much picked up that piece for us. And there was a fairly substantial investment in developing the site plan and everything that is needed to file for the connection agreement. We haven't gotten beyond that stage, and I'd have to say that the National Grid was, for us, our sugar daddy. They took good care of us that way, and we really appreciate it. And we still stand. That investment will pay off when we get to the next stage.
The financing for each individual member was going to be managed by the Mass Solar Loan. We had negotiated with them to make this, and they actually had set up a separate portal for Wendell. So in that financing is still available to
So
UMass Financing.
financing is self-financing?
Yes,
You're not
yeah.
going to go to some entity or?
No. And so every individual manages their own purchase. They can do cash, they can do financing, they can do whatever they wanted to. But it was an individual's 100%.
And so as long as the organization stays, the financing will stay?
So there was a couple of, so just to clarify that, there's a couple of stages. So the first relationship stage was a relationship with Northeast Solar. So an individual would come and say, I want to buy 40 panels in this solar. And we'd say, okay, here's the cost for those 40 panels. that transaction would happen through a mass solo loan or individual financing, however they wanted to do it, and that money would pass to Northeast Solar. And Northeast Solar would use those funds to build the array. And then the second transaction would be with the cooperative. So then they would have $500, which they would pay to join the cooperative, which is the local cooperative, and then that's the second transaction that they would have. So purchasing the system allowed them to become a co-op member, then they would enter an agreement with the co-op and become a co-op member, and now they're in it. The $500 that each co-op member paid was going to be used to fund the initial cost of the system, administrative, setting up the LLC or the co-op, the cooperative, you know, and all those kind of legal expenses to get it all set up. And that was going to be the co-op seed money, which the co-op would manage themselves. So that's how the transactions were set up.
You mentioned that you're working on similar concepts in the eastern part of the state because there's not the same impediments?
So the spot, well, no. So our initial hope with the solar cooperative was this wasn't to be exclusive to Northeast Solar. I mean, I did this. I mean, I spent more money personally on this project than Northeast Solar. It was kind of a self-financed thing because I didn't want to burden the company with all these big legal bills and stuff like that. And I was fortunate enough to have that capital available to me. So our initial thought was that once we built the first model of Wendell, we also were working with Coleraine and Conway, and we had some other communications going. And then the grid kind of shut down and the SMART program shut down here. But what we would do after that is that there's other similar companies with similar business models like Northeast Solar's that we were going to essentially license this product to. Say, okay, here's the blueprint, here's all the contracts, here's all the legal agreements, everything you need to get started. We only ask that we have some oversight to make sure that it isn't abused, but you can start building it in this area or that area or that area. So because of the SMART programs capped here locally in Western Mass and National Grid, Eversource East, which is at inside 495, essentially 95 loop in those communities out there, still has a lot of capacity in that program. And so we've been approached by other companies to see if we can start working with local municipalities there to find areas to start building these projects out there. And so that it just doesn't stop.
Can you explain, as a follow-up, can you explain the difficulty of ownership outside of your current utility and connecting to another utility?
You have to be in your utility's footprint. So if you're in National Grid, the only way you can participate in the program is if you stay in National Grid. So if you move into Eversource territory, you can no longer participate. And there's a number of those things that are spelled out in the contracts, but that's pretty specific. It's like any other time. You have to maintain your utility's footprint.
Yes, in back.
I'm just curious about how is a co-op incorporated? Like, is it a nonprofit or I don't know anything about it?
It was a nonprofit. It was a single entity co-op, cooperative. Under the Massachusetts laws, cooperative as a nonprofit. You have to be careful with the nonprofit status on how it's categorized, because if it's a nonprofit, you didn't want it to become the owner of the system. It's just the co-op. The members are the owners, because if you put those in the same entity, then you lose the tax benefit. So there's a couple of hurdles.
Wow, that's clever.
Yes.
I just had a question, kind of in general. When we win, as happy as I am to see fields of solar, even if it's done by bad guys, at least it's not fossil fuels. But I also understand that farmers, if we stick them up on poles and separate them a little bit, you can do agriculture underneath.
Yes.
I'd like to hear something about the design, and if you're doing any designs that incorporate, so you don't have to use empty or unused land. The land can continue to be used for agriculture.
Yeah, so there's a company called Hyperion who started this, several years ago. Hyperion?
Hyperion.
So Hyperion started several years ago, and the founder of that company regrettably passed away, but his son has taken it over. They've been working with our company, and we've got a few different current designs that we're gonna be building. These are very effective there, and there is actually an incentive within the SMART program for those also, for the dual use. It's kind of like canopies or dual use. And those are primarily, the best benefit to those are when, and we're looking actually at a solar cooperative model that's built on a by-use platform. So if you have like a dairy farmer who has a lot of pasture land, you can install this array high enough up that the cattle can still graze and he can still get around, do what he needs to do. And you have a power plant that serves dual function. It supports the farm by giving it regular revenues. So the farmer's got another revenue stream to support his operations. You have the ability to maintain that farm, and you can have the community that's invested.
Yes. Yes.
I just want to clarify your business model. You know, you put this stuff together, and the way you make money is on the construction.
Yes.
And, you know, downstream maybe the franchising of the process.
Yes, license, whatever. That's actually how we decide to do it.
Okay,
Yeah.
just checking.
I noticed nobody answered the technological blow-up question, actually. Is there a technological fix for this explosion in midair and?
No,
No, there's no
not
technological
currently, not unless you
fix.
can shield. There's no, if somebody blows an EMP bomb above everything that we have that's electronic, your phone, your car, anything is done.
And you don't have to worry about it.
And you don't have to worry about electricity. We're all gonna be back to the Stone Age really quickly.
Yes.
So if $3.9 million fell out of the sky, then this could just all move ahead. Is that
No.
right? No?
No, it shouldn't.
No, that's
No?
a study.
No, now that they've identified that the grid is over capacity for whatever reason, even if we had the interconnection money,
Even if someone just gave you $3.9 million.
they would still,
They have to
it's
do all
a
that
long,
work.
so, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do sit there and lay in bed. Why not? I sit there and lay in bed at night and think about these things. We've tried to build one of these solar cooperatives 3 times. And each of the 3 times that we got very close, the first one was in Northampton. Each of the 3 times that we got close, the utility swapped something out. Net metering, the way the programs. I can tell you that the people that I've talked to that are, work with utility and are in utility are kind of like freaked out by this. Because if you can have, it's one thing to have 30% of your customers available to get, to not pay their bills. It's another thing to get 100% of your customers no longer paying your bills. All of a sudden they look like the cable company and losing all their client base. So these solar cooperative models, as nice as they're coming out, seem to be a real hedge for them. They just are just really concerned that if this model is actually able to take off, they will be forced to be different in their business model and how they are. And there is a lot of money at stake.
So $3.9 million, even if you got it,
So
then you still
when
have all
when-
these other hurdles after that.
So when the latest conversations that I had, not the latest ones, a little ways back, if we would have paid, we had to pay the $1 million up front.
Yeah.
And then it would take about 2 to 3 years to then actually do the work. And then we'd pay the balance when it was finished. And I said, all right, what if we do that? And they said, well, we need that deposit. I said, all right, well, let me just see where everything's at on this thing. And then when I came back to them, they said, actually, no, because there's so much other storage behind you, we're going to have to do this study now. So even if we had the money to move forward, because there's so much other solar out there, in the whole Belchertown, Quabbin region and everything else, that we can't just rebuild this one. We need to rebuild this, we need to rebuild all the other ones, we need to rebuild all the overheads.
Yeah.
So this is going to take a long-term study. So they had 600 megawatts waiting to be interconnected within the area. Huge, huge number. And they charged everybody to participate in the study. So they charged us to participate in the study, which I paid. So it was $1,000 per megawatt. So we only had to pay $220 or whatever our AC capacity was. But you think about this. This is an 8-month study. It's going to go only on for 8 months. And they charge the solar developers $600,000 $1,000 per megawatt to perform the study. Not a bad business model. Doesn't sound like a lot when you say it's just $1,000 per megawatt. But when you add it up, so they're gonna get an 8-month study for $600,000.
10 experts working full-time at $100,000 a year.
Well, no, that's what when the guy was on the phone with me, he's a nice guy too. I've come to know a lot of the National Grid employees. I don't blame the employees of National Grid. It's, you get the poor person on the phone, it's not them that are making the decision. They're just doing their job. And so they gotta get up, put their feet on the floor, make the same decision we all make every day, which is, do I wanna do this anymore, or do I not wanna do this anymore? But when I asked him about it, I go, it's only gonna take 8 months, you're gonna spend $600,000 on it? I go, how many engineers you putting on this? He goes, I don't know.
2.
I go, isn't this all done with software anyway? He goes, I don't know. So yeah, it's crazy.
Yes.
Just out of interest, that's 2,400 person hours at $250 an hour.
Okay, that's good. That's good math. All right, it's
my-
possible.
About a year and a third.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, well, they got
But my
to pay the
question
CEO.
is,
Yeah.
there is an issue of people who have the money or the access to put solar panel up.
Yep.
And the amount of solar panel they're putting back into the grid, they're not paying for maintenance, however that is. And I guess my question is there a way of determining current maintenance costs on some unit basis by an entity that everybody could trust, so that, when you put solar panel in, you're actually paying for whatever you would have paid for maintenance? Because there is maintenance issues, there are maintenance issues, they're
Sure.
ongoing.
Sure.
Poles fall down, this and that and the other thing. Batteries won't help that. So the
Nope.
question is, has anybody ever come up with the idea how much current maintenance costs on a kilowatt basis or some unit basis? And is that a legitimate fee to pay if you put solar up?
So there's a number of different ways that we've tried to look at this over the 10 years that I've been in the industry, and John's been a part of these conversations, and we all have to some extent. So there's a term called the value of solar. How much, the value of solar. How much value does the production of solar actually put back into the grid? And how valuable is it to the utilities? So you're pumping your electrons out. The utility's not buying power from anybody else, they're just getting it from you. They're compensating you at a fair market value for it. They're still gonna, and is that value sufficient enough to cover the maintenance costs long term? So the utilities have come back and said, well, what we'd like, I love the way they phrase this, they must have like focus groups. Minimum monthly reliability contribution.
That's heavy, dude.
MMRC is what they call it. So they're coming up and saying, we'd like to get a minimum contribution from everyone who puts solar on the roof. But we can't define what that looks like because there's no visibility in the utility. We don't know what it costs them. We don't know how much they upgrade. We don't know when the last time they upgraded anything is. You drive some of these rural communities and you go up there and take a look at the transformer that's sitting out in front of someone's house and you go, my God, that's circa 1958. And you'll have to upgrade it probably when you interconnect it. But so there's no visibility. If there was an open visibility where everybody would sit down and just open up their books and say, okay, this is what it's going to take to maintain the grid. This is how our employee base works. This is for grid resiliency. These are the numbers we want. Then you could actually put some real hard numbers to it. We could probably come up with a reasonable solution to support a bi-directional grid for the commonwealth of everyone in the commonwealth. So, but we can't get that visibility because they don't want to give it to us.
Isn't that a DPU 5?
Sounds like an ACLU.
Yeah, well, I'm really not sure where it comes from. But again, these are the things that we struggle with, and like the $3.9 million, right? There's one line in the tariff, one line in this huge document that just says, essentially, utilities allowed to charge whatever full cost that is needed to make these types of upgrades. That's it. So they don't say they have to line item anything, they don't say they have to provide you a receipt, they don't have to account for their hours, they don't have
So
to do anything.
could Al Norman sue them over that
I
line?
guess. I mean, it's a regulatory,
ACLU.
it's kind of a regulatory thing, but one of the things that's been very beneficial to the utilities, that a lot of people have overlooked in these conversations is, if they gotta put a new three-phase line in, and new poles down the street to bring a power plant online, typically the community that resides in is able to look at the infrastructure upgrade and say, oh, your tax basis has changed now. So your property tax basis or your excise tax basis, whatever it is now a little bit more valuable. You know, towns get a lot of money from utilities on tax basis. But if it's purchased by a solar installer, it doesn't go on the tax basis rolls. So they're able to improve their infrastructure without the tax liability and still get the same value. Smart people.
It just seems like the whole talk has been about communities coming together to do things in the public interest, bumping against a grid that's owned by corporations. There's no public option. I mean, are we talking healthcare here? There's no public option, there's no, and we know there's no regulation. In fact, the opposite. I don't know how many people remember that time that Bush and Cheney went into that secret meeting about energy policy in this country, and we never ever found out what passed. I feel like we're stymied in all these idealistic local control community efforts until we tackle the thing above, that stranglehold.
You know, I've been chasing windmills for decades, and you know, this is just alls I try to do in my life is to find those things which I feel that I can control the best. And there's I'm going to be turning 58 soon, and I haven't stopped chasing windmills, but I'm a lot slower at it. I just try to do the smaller stuff. And there's people out there that are better equipped, better informed.
Are there people doing what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Do you know the names of organizations? Who's working at trying to
So one of the groups,
decolonize the grid?
the group that I'm traveling with down to DC, the Union of Concerned Scientists.
And also Northeast Solar.
Yeah, so there's people out there that are fighting it, and there's all kinds of solar advocacy groups out there. There isn't a unified voice in a lot of it, and it's actually it's like a lot of the other big questions, healthcare and all these, it's just so big, and it's so entrenched into everything that we do that it's just really hard to wrap everything up.
Yeah, if people remember the fires in California, oh, we didn't maintain these things and this is why these fires started in California. Well, PG&E, which owns all those things, used to be, when they formed, it was a publicly owned system. And then, of course, it was taken, Ronald Reagan came in, we sold this to private, and now this is what we get. Yeah, and now they're going bankrupt because they didn't maintain their lines. I'm sorry, people raised their hands, I didn't see who had it up first.
So, in answer to her question, I mean, the FCCPR put on this conference, and the question that we're raising is, where can we have leverage? And I would say the sense of this meeting, we're just getting together to talk about this, but you could ask us to go back to FCCPR and say that bi-directional grid becomes something that we're organizing around, and that what we need is transparency from the utilities to get that.
Yeah.
And then what are the pressure points? Seems to me not just the legislators, but making them show up at the public hearings and be accountable. What does it take to open things up? And you talked about them bringing gas line. Well, we stopped the pipeline coming in, and there's another one in the South County. I was at a Climate Action Network, and they're going to try and stop the little one that's coming in the bottom of the county. So it is going to be citizen action that can change the terms of this, and that's what we can do together as part of FCCPR.
One fact, just interject one fact on him. There is no court in the land or in the world that can compel a private corporation to open its books.
It's a publicly
And that's a
regulated
fact that I can give you lots and lots of lawsuits on.
Well, and no one has talked about the impact of C-PACE, commercial PACE, if it ever gets underway. It's now at mass development. It passed the state legislature in 2016. They put it into cold storage, as far as I can tell. The town of Greenfield passed it through the town council. If you're not familiar with C-PACE, you should explore it. It's commercial PACE funding. It's locally based.
Yeah.
But the important thing about it is, where is the capital going to come from? Where's the capital going to come from to do, for instance, my house? I put the solar collectors on the roof. I took the capital out of my IRA, but I had to have a source of capital. So where's the capital going to come from for like massive storage and stuff like that? So you should go to the Green Bank session today.
Yes.
So it's been introduced. Green banks theoretically, and we're looking at, Connecticut, which had a meltdown, but New York, anyway. Theoretically, you get a certain amount of tax money into the green bank to get it rolling, and then you get somewhere between 5 and 10 times as much private capital investment in the green bank that becomes the capital, totally directed onto a green transition. So, I mean, there's the capital.
Question?
I think Carolyn's point is really important, that who owns the grid, and it was designed to be a public service, and it's not accountable at this point. And until we solve that problem, the transition to a just and sustainable economy is not going to happen. Capitalism has caused climate change, has caused tremendous social inequity, and if we're going to address either one of those problems, we need to have public control of the grid. I do think that that's, and the Koch brothers are funding a lot of utility pushback and this kind of shaming the left for doing all this solar that doesn't benefit low-income people, and now we're going to take the billions of dollars we've been putting into renewables and we're going to put a few $100s into low-income solar. I mean, the whole debate, and looking at what's going on in Florida, where utilities are winning the move to have all renewables be utility owned, which is just replicating the fossil fuel industry. We have an opportunity to create a more accountable economy here, and I think owning the grid would be a good thing for this organization to. We don't have a model for what the future of the utilities is going to look like, and this is a great place to host a conversation about that. What's the future of the grid, the future of utilities, and how do we transition there in a way that makes sense?
Yes.
And that would be
Yes.
In response to your question and others, when you say we can never have private companies have their books open to us, well, we have a regulatory commission, which we know is kind of a joke because all the people who are on that commission used to work for the utility companies. And if we could change that, and that would go back to Richard, your question about can we find out how much it actually costs for each thing. Well, if the regulatory commission said, you can't charge that unless you open it up and show us how much, we're going to charge this much. And if the utilities then say, no, it costs us more than that, you can say, prove it. And so not only the state legislator, but the person we elect as governor as well, has to be part of this consortium that says, we're not going to put utility people on the regulatory commission. We're actually going to make it respond to, as you're saying, the public, because it's supposed to be in our favor. So I think that regulatory commission might be a really important place to start.
Yes, one more question here.
Well, it's not a question. The problem isn't capitalism. It's people. It's the senior executives who want to take money at the expense of something else. It is the shareholders who are fickle as hell, doing things that, by and large, management doesn't respond to the shareholders. They respond to their own personal interests, not unlike politicians. So when you start talking about capitalism, you got to understand it's a social phenomenon, nothing more, nothing less, and therefore there's only a certain amount you can do, or you have to provide some guidance to personal behavior you know, when you're in a position of power, which we seem to be piss poor at and have been for about, what, 340 years or something.
All right, well, we're gonna have to break up. It's getting close to 11 o'clock, where we go back. We'll have one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
And I'd just love to make just a statement
Yeah.
about what municipalities can do. One of the things that Co-op Power is doing in partnership with a very large city nearby called New York City, they put out an RFP and they said they wanted low-income solar. And so they put out an RFP for city-owned land. So the Brooklyn Army Terminal is a very large building, right, which the city owns. And so they said, we want solar here. And we want it to benefit low-income people, and we want an ownership. We want local ownership of this. And then they also said, we've got all these public housing buildings, New York City Housing Authority buildings. And so we want locally owned solar that's going to benefit low-income people. And Co-op Power, the New York City Community Energy Co-op bid with Co-op Power on those, and we got 2 megawatts of community solar awarded to us. So we're in the middle of working on those. Will be built this year. So municipalities can really make a difference on how you use your land and how you structure your RFPs to say this is what we want. And if you do that, you've got some great bidders here in the room.